So, without further ado, Chris Edmundson, you know what, Chris? I know you're an instructor, at, but we had a bio. I was reading it, and you're over in Colorado. So, we're supposed to be in your neck of the woods uh, this this week. So, we're virtually there. Thank you for virtually having us. I think it said somewhere that you've been doing middleware and identity management currently, but that you've been in the field for about 25 years. And I gotta say, it's probably been a ton of change that you've seen over that lifetime. So, while some people might look at this and go, "Wait, it's identity management. We're at a HackFest event." As somebody who's spent a ton of time on the red team, identity management is super key. So while people might want to look at exploits and all that really advanced things, identity management is critical, especially in today's world. So, Chris, your talk is where the I can't say that is my identity. You're the program manager over at the University of Colorado, and I will let you go.
Pipe. All right. So happy to be here with all of you. It's a pleasure. It's a big shout out to Kate Marshall, my friend who I started with SANS probably close to 15 years ago. It feels like something like that. Hope everybody's doing well out there. And this presentation is where the blank is my identity. And hope you enjoy and hope you get a lot out of this. All right. Sorry, it took me a second to click there. This is a little bit about me, but the reality is I just want you to take a minute and just say, when I was a boy, I grew up in a really small town in Northeast Texas, and my dad taught me measure twice, cut once, because we had to drive like 45 miles to get to the closest, what I would qualify as like a Home Depot or Lowe's or whatever, to get the things we need to do the building we did. And so we had to be pretty precise and accurate as far as what we needed. But what I really want you to look at here is my identity. So in identity and access management, we think about things like attributes. So if you look at this page, how many attributes do you think you could see? Well, there's quite a few for all of you out there. Of course, there's credentials, what certification somebody has, or, what my role is. Like, say I'm a SANS instructor, for example, it says it right at the top. Well, you might kind of determine based on what I have here that I work for the University of Colorado because of the logo up there. And, you might also look at things like, maybe if you zoomed in, you might see the color of my eyes, or, the fact that, what ethnicity I am or whatever. So lots of things you can gather from just the simple things that we take for granted a lot of times. So really identity management is really about the attributes. We refer to attributes all the time in the language we use. So hopefully you get that picture. All right, so quick poll here. What is the most common and expensive attack vector? I'm going to put this in the hallway. If you're familiar with hashtag hallway Chris Edmundson, I'm going to stick this in there, and if you could just take a minute and take a look at this and tell me what you think. Give you guys a moment there to look through that. So far, it looks like a lot of people think system glitches and human error. A lot of insider attacks. A few spammers. So far, looks like everybody's thinking system glitches and human error. That seems like the winner so far. Well, the reality is actually it's malicious attacks. So malicious attacks, according to the Ponemon Institute, was the most common and most expensive cause of breaches. And what always surprises me when I see this statistic is It's 314 days that they tend to last before they can be identified and contained, which is pretty shocking and scary, actually, of course. And not that I'm trying to scare you necessarily, but that's basically to give you an indication of why we need to really protect our identities. And so because they're really the central core of how people access applications, how they live their everyday lives, everything about them. And so many of you actually looked at the system glitches and also human error, and that actually is second as the root cause for nearly 49%, of course, of the breaches, and they're pretty costly too, of course, at 3.24 million and 3.5 million respectively. So sorry, yeah, trick question. So what is identity and access management? Just like to take a minute to kind of set the stage and give you just a real brief definition of identity and access management. And quite frankly, we could spend a whole week, we could do a week-long course, no problem at all, to talk about what identity and access management means and how it works from a security perspective and how to test for things and all those kinds of things. But I want you to concentrate on this, and it's all about the person. It's about the person's identity and how they're maintained, they're modified, they're monitored throughout their life cycle. That's what's key to remember. And then also, of course, what do they have access to? Is it appropriate? Is it not appropriate? Those kinds of things. So some of the things they need to look for, of course, are how one's role is developed, and should they have administrative access or not, and those kinds of things. But it can even go farther than that too. I can speak for some of the university systems that I work with, and they range from everything from a doctor's needing access all the way down to like a medical technician needing access. That's why it's so important to understand the roles and privileges there. So the real challenge for me, and I don't know about you all out there, if you work in the identity and access management space, I just want to mention also is if you're interested, there's a real shortage for identity and access management professionals, and having a class or having experience in those kind of things are also pretty useful as well. And so if any of you are interested, I know plenty of people looking for employees in that area. So this is kind of a typical identity analytics dashboard to watch what's going on in your identity and access management space. Just to give you an idea, on average here at the university where I work, not here because I'm at home right now, but when I'm at work and I'm at the university and I'm doing university work, we average about 100 accounts a day. That's on average. Now, at fall startup or like spring semester startup, it can be even more than that. We also oftentimes add applications. So today, we might have 87 applications like shown here, and tomorrow we might have 89 or whatever. So on average, we add 1 or 2 applications a month, and sometimes we remove 1 or 2 a month, just depending upon what's going on. But I'm going to do a little math here just to give you an idea. So if you take the numbers that are on the screen, the possible combinations here, and I'll just write out my math here on this in invisible ink, so to speak. You have 308,907 people using the system in identity and access management, 87 applications. And if you were to take, let's say, a general user role and an administrative role, that would equate to 53,749,818 possible combinations. So as you can tell, it's pretty crazy as far as how complex identity and access management can get. So let's take this a step forward. And so, like I said, it's dynamic in nature. So if we now have more users, which changes by the minute, sometimes by the hour, applications get added, we can now increase just by adding a couple of more applications and more users to the actual identity and access management space. Now, a whole another million, basically 54,998,084 now possible combinations. How crazy is that? I mean, we just jumped a million more combinations just by adding a couple of applications and a few more users to the system. So hopefully you can start to get the idea of how complex identity and access management can get. in a world that I live in. So some of you may be history buffs. I don't know if you are. I am. I really like to look at history. And so I found a couple of really great articles to share with you. The laws and flaws of identity. It's been written about a lot over the years, so it's not new news, that is. You know, people like Kim Cameron from Microsoft wrote about the 7 essential laws. I'll just pick out a couple here. I mean, some of you're probably used to understanding terms like user control and consent. You know, those have become very popular these days, especially with now how people access systems, whether or not they want to divulge the attributes that they have from the identity access management system into an application. Also, of course, it seems like the bigger challenge for me these days that I work with a lot of people on with communication and organizational change management is the human side of things. So the human integration and the consistent look and feel and their user experience. And then lastly, not to say that we don't have a lot of flaws. We do definitely have a lot of flaws. We're always looking to fine tune identity and access management. But there was a great article written by IEEE on the 7 flaws of identity management back in 2008. So these are good reference points if you want to get a little bit deeper dive into some of the historical references out there. All right, so time for another quick poll to test your knowledge here. Bear with me a second, I'll just pop that in. So what's the average cost per record in the US? Per record lost. Let's see what's happening over here in the poll. So far, looks like $200 is winning. 250 is taking the lead again. $250. See some chats in there for $150. Whatever Chris says. It's awesome. Thanks, Jeff. All right. It looks like kind of 250 is kind of the winner at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the actual answer. So again, according to the Ponemon Institute, it's $150. So again, let me do my little math here. 300,000 identities, just to take a quick number, times 150 per record lost. If you think about that, $45 million. Ouch. Yeah, really. I mean, it's doable to see the skyrocket basically for cost. So another reason why we need to really protect our identity and access management systems out there. So the more protection, the better, basically. Crazy stuff. So here's a practical example, and I'm not picking on Zoom by any means here, but I just want to take you through an example here that's pretty typical. Cloud-based solution, Zoom, how it actually gets used by individuals, and where is the information at. So let's just kind of step through this for a second. These are practical places for you to do reconnaissance, discovery, and attack vectors. So if you think about here in the middle, on the left, that is Zoom. So Zoom's storing your credentials, your username and your password, and they have a database sitting behind that they use. You could have federated authentication with single sign-on, SSO, and that's probably going to be related to an identity and access management system that's doing provisioning into Zoom. So creating your user accounts and deleting them and taking care of your accounts, and even giving you roles and privileges inside of Zoom, because some people have more privileges than others, like the administrator may have more privileges than the typical user. Then, of course, you've got the good old social federation, like Google and Facebook. So yet another place to look for. You can see this starts to get really complex really fast. And then you got things like LDAP and directories that sit behind this, behind the federation and behind the single sign-on pieces. You've got applications and databases that sit there. Even integration with third-party applications with APIs, or maybe you send a flat file up to the system. Again, federated and social authentication, provisioning, what have you. And then you got the end users. You know, how protected are they? gets and post data from logs. I mean, the challenge, how do you actually do all these things? How do you protect all of these entry points? It's difficult, to say the least. And then last but not least, how do we balance all of this with user experience and securing their identity? It's crazy stuff. So then you have the age-old question: have I been pawned? You know, have I actually been compromised? Of course, you could look on this website and see if you have been, but from an identity and access management point of view, you want to look at analytics, you want to look at intelligence, and especially governance as it relates to that. And more importantly, you really want to have a compromised account process of some kind. At the university, I can tell you that we have a compromised account process that leverages our service desk, our security operations team, even some infrastructure folks. So as soon as we know a system has been compromised by an account, we can go in and lock it down and take care of it. But more importantly is, how do you prevent it before and not be reactive? So those are some of the things we want to talk about as well. Identity and access governance, that's really how you take care of it. You really have to really walk through the process of understanding all the pieces and parts. It's a lot more complex than a lot of people realize. We have account provisioning, we have account requests through like self-service. So if someone's asking for something, do we give it to them? Who approves it? Do we certify them? Do we know who they are? And then there's data governance. Who are we giving the data out to? What applications? What are the policies associated? What are their roles, entitlements? And then, of course, you need identity intelligence and analytics to be able to see all the things that go on. And basically, in a nutshell, this is measuring your organizational maturity. And again, there's a high demand for people. We talked about this a little while ago, but there's a huge need for more identity and access management professionals out there. And then, of course, there's a lot of technical resources and process things we need to look at. But this all is very, very complex and challenging for many organizations. So let's break it down. Let's try to make it simpler. So given the hybrid approach, do we just take a sledgehammer? So how many of you out there like to demolish, do demolition, all that good stuff? Take a sledgehammer to something. I do. I love it. My problem is I don't really like to clean it up, so I'm looking for somebody else to help me with that kind of stuff. My wife will attest to that. Do we buy versus build? You know, what do we do? So things like multi-factor authentication and the promise of cloud access security brokers like CASB, you know, will they fix these problems? Do we do a better job with things like API management, where we do more with policies like using OAuth technologies, and we're watching traffic and we're auditing traffic? You get the idea. It gets pretty difficult to do true governance for identity and access management. There's a lot of resources out there, frankly. There's quite a few resources that I think people don't really necessarily always leverage. And I'm just going to give you a handful here and just kind of poke at them a little bit and tell you, like OWASP is a great example. They have a whole set of tests for testing identity and access management systems. Testing roles, testing the user registration process, you know, how do users claim their accounts when they first start to work for an organization? How do you deal with guessing accounts? How do you deal with username and password policies? All those kinds of things. And I'm going to tell you just a quick story about an experience I had. Not doing the value of testing is huge. I was working with an enterprise portal a few years ago, and it turns out that it went live in production, and it turns out that you could actually type in a username as long as you had a valid username, but then you could have a blank password or just anything for the password for that matter. Ouch. What a simple test that could have been done before the production system went live. Just as a very simple example of how we can take advantage of identity management testing ahead of time. We can also leverage CIS controls. There's, of course, I'm going to give a plug here for SANS here for a second. They have a whole class on just the CIS controls. I took it from James T. If you don't know, he's the author of that class and manages that class. And so you can really get into this. But one of the things that's been pushed around quite a bit is the idea that identity is now the new perimeter. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because now people aren't behind your corporate firewall. They're not necessarily behind the things that we used to think of as the perimeter. Now the perimeter is, I've got my mobile device, I've got my laptop. You know, enough said. We work from home these days. So how are we protecting our actual accounts, and how are we actually protecting our people from all the potential attack vectors that are happening these days? When we have things like bring your own device, for example, and those kinds of things, we need to protect those things as well. Of course, we also want to make sure we do proper account monitoring and control. But again, all these can be leveraged to the CIS controls. A great resource for that. And then, of course, cloud. You know, everything's cloud these days. Of course, the migration from the on-premise and out to the cloud is predominant these days. I'm seeing it quite a bit. In fact, I will tell you that, roughly speaking, in probably the last 2 years of my work at the university, I'd say predominantly most of the services we do, single sign-on, federation, all that kind of thing, probably 80% or more are cloud-based solutions out there. So it's becoming more and more prevalent. So are we leveraging contracts? Are we actually looking at contracts to make sure we have those protections put in place for privileges, for roles, for how we handle data integrations, and how we actually feed these systems? And then once the systems are there, are we actually applying the right security to the data that's in them? All those kinds of things. The Cloud Security Alliance is a great resource for those kinds of things. In particular, I will say that you can also look to see if the company that you're working with is even in support of the Cloud Security Alliance. A lot of the companies out there actually take advantage of the Cloud Security Alliance recommendations and guidance. So I'd like to take you through this for a second. I'm not going to read these questions to you, but I'd like you to understand where I'm coming from: the why, the how, the what. We've kind of talked about some of these things, but basically, in a nutshell, know thyself. Are we actually leveraging the full potential of our systems, meaning identity and access management systems? Are we actually deploying things, or are we leveraging some of the technologies that are been purchased there, for example, like the CASB, like the ability to do those kinds of things? API management. Are we actually looking at how we're securing third-party access, and whether or not we have customers looking at it? Are we preventing? Are we detecting? All these things. And, you know, I didn't really push too hard on this, but multi-factor authentication is so predominant anymore with almost every service provider out there that I really don't see there's any reason not to just apply this to not just administrators, but even individual users for that matter. So the who and the what, we kind of talked about the attributes earlier on. The who is the identity of a person. So think of a person being the identity. The what is the attribute. So remember, like my picture or my credentials or those kinds of things. The why, it's simple. We kind of talked about that before, about the cost of a breach. You know, $45 million if you had 300,000 identities stolen. That's a lot of money. I mean, obviously we need to think about those kind of things. So it's pretty easy to estimate the risk factors when it comes to those kinds of things. And of course, again, with the why, you know, are we actually doing a good job with washing our systems and making sure that if we do have a breach, that we get on top of that breach as soon as possible and not let it last for 314 days on average that was talked about before, as far as time it takes to contain that. And then when, no time like the present. Let's take advantage of these things, like the Cloud Security Alliance, like the CIS controls, like all these things that we have at our fingertips. They don't always have to cost money. They're free-ish, is what I call the technology that's out there, that's available from the guidance from the Cloud Security Alliance and from like the CIS controls. Yeah, they cost money in person time, but they're free resources that we should be leveraging. And then really keep in mind, these questions are iterative. I think about these kinds of questions all the time whenever I put systems in. I'm always asking, like the business user, like, have we thought about this? Have we thought about that? And I use questions like this to check off, have they actually looked at all the possibilities and cycle through them constantly. Again, iterative means continuing to pound on these questions with every situation, with every application, with everything we do. I'd like to open it up for questions and comments, but I do want to say one more thing that's really important. There's a lot of need for identity and access management specialists and professionals out there. I'd love to consider the idea of hopefully this is giving you some food for thought as far as becoming a specialist in the identity and access management space. But more than anything, if you're in the world of penetration testing, or you're in auditing or evaluating systems, to keep in mind all these resources that you have, and keep in mind that all these questions to ask. And again, back to my mantra, measure twice, cut once. Let's work on our precision and accuracy whenever we deal with these systems. I think we can open it up for questions, or is that?
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely. I've got a few that I've collected here, Chris.
Sure.
And actually, I did have a kind of one that I want to ask. So you work at the medical center, and I had spent the first 10 years of my career actually working as a network and security person at major hospitals. So this is kind of near and dear to my heart. But one of the things that always frustrated me was doctors and their passwords. And I'm sure you've had this experience. And until you work in health IT, you don't realize one doctor can have, do you know how many passwords they could have, how many different medical systems they could work with?
We're fortunate that we only really use one that I'm involved with, but you're right. There's a lot of them.
Yeah. So I know doctors that they work at 7-8 different hospitals, right? So a doctor's identity could show up in 7 different password management systems, 7 different, Active Directory accounts, 7 different medical EMRs with 7 different password complexity requirements and 7 different usernames. And so before you know it, they've got exponential growth in the number of accounts, and it's a pretty interesting problem to kind of solve. So
yeah, we continue to work with our medical school, especially in that case, with trying to come up with unique and creative ways to help them, because especially when you think of an emergency room doctor, right? They need to walk in and they need access to system data, about a person's records, health records, et cetera, pretty fast. So, the idea that they have to type in their username, their password, and then, okay, now we're going to multi-factor you. And, so we're having to come up with creative ways to help them with those kinds of things as well, like using cards and card readers and what have you, and that kind of thing. So it's a great example.
Yeah, we were experimenting with Sunrays back in the day, and we would try to take the smart cards out of the Sunrays, and there's no good answer here, right? That's kind of what I want to get at. That sometimes it's just this single identity problem has been going on, and I started working with healthcare in like the late 90s, so it's been going on since at least that long. I'm sure you could tell me it's been going on longer. So it's a pretty interesting problem, and yeah, you're right. MFA probably exacerbates it more, right? Like the fact that maybe you have to wait for something to show up before you can log in, and someone's bleeding out. Not ideal.
They can't afford the time, so to speak.
Yeah. So there was some other questions, a few here that I saw. One is, it's a broad question, but regarding identity, is there a way to protect our identity, right? So what, maybe 1 or 2 things that you can recommend to anybody that's listening to help them just with their own identity management kind of problem that they may have to face?
Well, I mean, I always give the 2 things I always give family and friends, right, kind of thing, is one is, if you can use multi-factor, by all means use multi-factor. It's probably one of the easiest things for most people to apply from more of a personal level. The other thing is just use a good password management. There's plenty out there, of course, on the planet. Don't use the same password everywhere. Change it up, those kinds of things. I mean, that's the simple, quick advice. I mean, but the reality is that, and I don't know how other people feel about this, but I know I feel this way about this as a security professional and working in the industry and what have you, is that I think, to be honest, some of it is just like, well, I think people know a lot about me. It's already out there, and I'm going to live with it. And I hope that I've protected the most important things like my financials, my other things that I hold near and dear to me. But for the most part, I'm kind of learning to live with maybe not necessarily having complete privacy.
Yeah, I mean, somebody can look up my LinkedIn later or whatever. They can tell where I've worked in the past that may or may not have been related to data. But what I can tell you is, as far as password managers, use any password manager
Yeah.
other than a text file and static passwords, right? It's like your iPhone one, Mozilla. Just use a password manager, right? I know people are like, oh, but it's in the cloud, and because it's in the cloud, I should just disregard it because that's just not safe. What's not safe is putting it in a text file on your desktop saying passwords, right? That's just not safe. So, or using one password, right? And the password being 12345,
Yeah.
which happens to be the combination to your luggage.
Sure.
So Chris, thank you very much. By the way, this is a topic that just blows my mind away all the time because it's still not solved. Oh, one more question that did show up, and then I'll move all these to the hallway for Chris. Do you have any guidance for people, especially senior executives that I see do this all the time, where they share their passwords?
Do I have any advice?
Yeah.
Well, there's probably plenty of bad stories out there, is what I would say, about executives who've had breaches before and how it's been pretty bad for them. I'd like to say I could come up with a couple off the top of my head, but the fact of the matter is that if you have authority and your authority is taken, you get what you deserve. I hate to say it that way. That sounds really blunt saying it that way. But if you're in a position of authority, I think you should be held, accountable. And I don't know, that's an opinion. It's not necessarily, well, I don't know if I said that well, but I'd say, from my point of view, that you get what you deserve if you share your password. It's like you've lost control.
Yeah. How about don't? Right. All right. So by the way, this is the URL where you can fill out Chris's eval. So please, if you could, make sure to fill out those evals so that we can gauge how the reception from the audience was and how all the members of participation. And if there's any comments or any questions, you can either ask them in the hallway. You can even leave it in the eval if you like.